Welcome to Sounds Like Portraits. I'm Philippe Ungar. This is a podcast with creative humans. In this episode, you'll hear film editor Bob Eisenhardt, three-time Emmy Award winner and Oscar nominee. I sat with him in his cutting room full of screens in midtown Manhattan. Bob is a storyteller. He told me about his role in the making of a film, especially in a nonfiction film. Editing is about manipulating the time and the space in order to show the truth behind what was going on. Manipulating, yes, he added, it's a tricky line and a slippery slope. It's time to listen to him. But before, he told me what he tried to do all his life.
All my life, I've always tried to figure out the how and why of things. I think that kind of exploration is kind of what I'm interested in, which is why documentaries kind of work for me, because it's kind of figuring out how a person goes about doing something and why, and how systems kind of work and why. So that's what I get to kind of explore all the time.
I'm smiling because it's exactly the type of things I'm interested in.
Yeah, I mean, if you're out there trying to understand, I mean, it's a good place to start. Yeah.
Bob, tell me, which film made the biggest impact on you before you joined the film industry?
As a kid, I kind of remember for some reason A Rebel Without a Cause made a big impression, and the other one I remember was Psycho, which I still to this day. I do not have I have a transparent shower curtain. And that may have made an impression on me as far as storytelling. I mean, I was very much into Hitchcock because I think he really kind of shows you how film should be put together. My first films I would be editing, I would be thinking, what would Hitchcock do at this point?
You got a degree in architecture. Would you make a parallel between architecture and documentary editing?
Well, there's a parallel for me. I don't know if there's a parallel for other people because that's kind of the way I think about it. I mean, for me, it's all about the structure, and it's similar to architecture. And I mean, I lay things out in a very kind of planned way. I kind of lay out a diagram of the thing before I start. Not everybody does that, but for me, it's kind of that architectural background that I think is working. Architecture is all about like coming up with solutions to problems, and I think that's what film editing is, coming up with solutions to telling the story. And you're usually constrained by a number of things. In architecture, it's really constricting because, you have a lot of elements like stairwells and windows and zoning restrictions and building codes. And so these seem like they kind of fence you in, but actually they're elements that you can use to your advantage to kind of make the space using those things, deal with the restrictions instead of trying to fight them. So I think that's a little bit of the way I go about the editing process too. Kind of diagram it out and try to solve a problem, try to figure out what the story is and then what you have to tell it. But the story often isn't so clear. It's not what you think it is. There's what happened, which is pretty clear. We did a film on Free Solo, which is a guy climbing El Capitan. It's a guy in a rock. That's what it is. But what's going on for him? Where did he come from? Why is he doing this? What does that mean to other people? How does that other people react to him? And what does it do for him? So all that is kind of what the story is. It's not just him and the rock. But so you have to kind of see what that means and then figure out how to express that. It's a puzzle solving thing, which is very much how it felt to me with architecture too, solving a puzzle.
Solving a puzzle. Are you inspired by Joseph Campbell's idea about storytelling and Christopher Vogler's vision on storytelling?
Well, the kind of the hero's journey is very much a basic storytelling. I mean, I tried, there's a lot of how to write a screenplay kind of things that rely very heavily on that idea. And I try to not get too boxed in by it, but it's kind of how to make a drama. So it does follow those things.
Universal rules.
Yeah. I mean, it's like there's usually three acts, and the hero has to go through certain problems, overcome certain problems to reach his goal. So that kind of struggle, that kind of basic conflict happens in fiction films, but it also happens in nonfiction films. The problem is it's a little harder to get there in nonfiction films.
That was exactly the question I was about to ask. There are basically two different kind of films. There are script films and unscripted films. Is it the same job for you?
Well, in nonfiction, you are writing the film after it's shot, in a sense. In a fiction film, you go and you write your screenplay, and then they go and try to film that screenplay, making adjustments along the way, and then they edit that, and it's kind of a rewrite of the script. But in the nonfiction process, it's certainly in the verite sense, when you kind of non-historical, real-life happenings, capturing that, it's very much writing the story as you're editing the story. So it takes a long time. If you add the writer's amount of time he spent and the editor's time, you kind of get a realistic version of how long it takes to do a feature-length nonfiction film.
So it's a combination of writing and cutting process.
It's kind of a back and forth because you kind of figure out what the story is and lay out those kind of beats of the story, the kind of journey of the story, and then you cut to that and see if you can make that work. And if it tells you that it's not working or it needs to be adjusted in some way, then you have to respond to that. But you try to kind of have an idea going after you've looked at the material and absorbed the material, then you try to figure out what a structure would be to tell that story. And then you cut to that structure. That's the way I do it. I mean, other people might not.
Can we take an example about this editing process?
Well, the editing process in nonfiction starts with looking at a lot of footage that they've shot. For instance, for Free Solo, it was over 700 hours, and so it took a long time to look at. And then the first thing I do is kind of make selects, which is separating the wheat from the shaft. And so now you have maybe a third of that, the best third of the material. And if you look at that, then you can begin to see where the story is, what the story is. When you're looking at 700 hours, by the time you get done with the 700th hour, you've kind of forgotten what the first hour was like. But when you get it down to a manageable thing, you can kind of get your arms around it and begin to see what it can be. So at that point, after I look at the selects, and usually I look at it with the director, then we can begin to see kind of where we can go with it.
What kind of conversation do you have with the director?
Well, we have a lot of conversation ahead of time because I think that the most important thing is to be on the same page. So it's kind of a mind meld kind of thing. So if you can be of one mind about this thing, then the solutions are going to address the same issues. I mean, if you're making two different films, that's when you get into trouble. But if you're making the same film, then all the ideas contribute to that. So we usually talk about how you feel about this person, what do you think his motivation is, what are your interests with him, reacting to the material. Just watching it with someone, you can see how they react, and you can see if your reaction is like them. If you laugh at the same places, then you know that that's funny. And that's important to remember, that was funny or that was scary. In terms of Free Solo, some of the spectacular high-angle climbing was really scary the first time you saw it. The 300th time you saw it, it wasn't so scary. You had to remember what it was like when you started. But kind of coming to a joint decision about how you feel about the material, that's the most important thing. And then I kind of offer a plan. This is how I think we could do it, and we talk that plan out.
So this kind of conversation helped the director to better know his own project, I guess.
Yes, they get to kind of analyze it, and you get to kind of see it through their eyes. And they have been through a strange process because by the time I come into the project, it's usually, 70% has been shot. I mean, Free Solo, we started talking before anything was shot, and many times as it was being shot. But I started 6 months before it was finished shooting. So there was a lot of discussion about what was interesting, what wasn't interesting, what the problems were, how we might focus on things, because, what's shot and what isn't shot is a big question. There's only so much time, so much money. What do we want to see? What's the most important things to see? So that kind of discussion is very important. And they may well have seen this footage a lot. They were there when it was shot, and they may have looked at it themselves. And so they're very much into it in a way that they can't see it fresh, with fresh eyes. So you are the fresh eyes when you start. So that's why I find it best to kind of, after you discuss things with the directors and know what they're trying to do, to kind of look at it yourself and take a pass at things, because you have the fresh perspective, they don't, and that reverses down the line. After you've been working on it for 9 months every day, and they haven't seen it every day, they have the fresher eyes.
So what's happening if you don't have this quality of relationship? If the relationship is not that good with the director?
Well, luckily, I've had pretty good relationships with directors, but there's a range. I mean, some of them are more involved than others. Some of them have a clear idea what they want, and so it has to kind of fit that way, fit into that mold in a way. Other people are interested in exploring more, but you kind of know that very quickly, so you can adapt to that.
To a certain point.
Yeah, I've had a few that haven't worked, but very, very few, considering how many I've done, yeah.
Would it be a good reason for you to refuse an interesting project?
Well, you have to be compatible, and so you have an interview and you talk it out, and then you can tell whether you're going to be able to work with this person. Just have a good flow of a relationship. And also what their point of view on the film is, It may be too different from yours. I had this experience rather recently where I really liked the subject matter, but the director's approach, I thought it was fresh and interesting, but also extremely risky, and I didn't really believe it was going to work. And that's fine, because you can make an adjustment down the line, but it looked like it was going to be a difficult adjustment, so I didn't take the job.
We are in your den.
Yes, yeah.
Can you describe it?
Well, the key points are the big monitor and the two smaller monitors.
Did you not mention the 3 big windows around us?
This is, you should put this in your contract. Yeah, you want the windows, and a lot of times you don't get them. So this is a very lovely room, yeah. And then I have a wall with cards, very old-fashioned, little index cards that I write up, color code, and put each scene on. And then I can rearrange those scenes. It's in a sense a storyboard, but I kind of like the cards because I can move them around a little more easily. Sometimes it drives the directors crazy, but they can't read it. I can understand, but I actually wrote out a regular outline for them when they were complaining. So it works for me. It enables things to be moved around, and you can kind of see the whole film. If you look at it from a distance, you can kind of see from the colors and the variations of the card, you can kind of see how the story is flowing.
Bob, how did you come to the documentary editing?
Well, I was in architecture school, and I took some film courses, and then I went to work in an architectural office, and it was a small office, so we would have hiatuses between projects and between stages of projects. So one time I decided, instead of taking a vacation, I was just going to look around in the film world and see what I could find. So I put my film under my arm. I didn't know anything about the business at all. I mean, I take courses, but that's it. And I looked in the yellow pages because that's the only way I knew. And I had more experience shooting film and shooting stills than editing, but I didn't realize that cinematographers don't have offices. So I ended up walking into a lot of editing facilities. And 3 days later, I was hired. They saw my film. They liked my film. They hired me, which was rather shocking. And then suddenly I was in the film business, and I never went back. I never went back to architecture. And they had me as an intern, and then They told me I had to join the union 2 weeks later, and so then I got an instant raise, and 6 months later I was editing.
What did technology change over the years in the editing process for you since the beginning?
Well, with film, nothing changed for a long time. Maybe half my career was on film, 35 millimeter and 16 millimeter, a lot of 16. And I kind of skipped the tape process, which was a terrible way to edit. This is nonlinear editing, which means you can move things around freely. Tape is not. So it was easy to move from film, a way of thinking about film, to a way of thinking digitally. And one of the first things they said when they were selling us the idea of digital editing was you can save a copy and keep going and make as many copies as you want. Usually there was just one copy, and if you changed something, you lost that copy. So I didn't quite understand, because the idea was you figured out what you were going to do. On film, you had to figure out what you were going to do and then do it. And that was a good process. That was a good thought process. It was a discipline that today a lot of people don't have. I tell my students, figure it out first. Write your outline, put up your cards on the wall, and then cut it, You can't just go in and start cutting, because it's meaningless. So I have used the duplicate idea in digital, and it's very helpful, but still, you don't want to rely on that too much. You want to figure out what you're trying to do first.
It's like a mapping process. You have to know where you want to go.
You need to know where the story is going, yeah. Now, every scene that they shoot could be cut a dozen different ways. So if you just try to cut a scene, there's no idea how to do it. You have to figure out what that scene can do for the film and then cut it for that. There's kind of the best way to do a scene, the best thing the scene does, and then the best thing the scene does in the show. There's a compromise in there. When you find just the best the scene can be, doing the best part in the movie, that's the key to it. That's the real goal.
What kind of freedom do you have? What kind of creativity do you have working on a film?
Well, I think since I've been around a while, I'm trusted, and I get a fair amount of freedom. I've been lucky enough to get a lot of that throughout my career, which is a wise choice, because the director can come in, get your ideas, and then if he doesn't like them, he'll change them, or he'll have you change them. But to be open to that, to be open for the editor's point of view, once he knows where you're coming from, makes a lot of sense for him. So most people are accepting of that. And if it works, it works,
When you say when it works, is it obvious for anyone?
It's obvious when it doesn't work. The problem is that it doesn't work for a very long time. The whole movie doesn't work for a very long time until it finally does. And it's kind of this gelling, because if you asked if it works, can anybody see it? Not really. If you get an audience in to see early cuts, and this is a kind of dangerous thing to do public screenings. So we do it in a very careful way, because the audience will come in and say, oh, that didn't work for me. I was confused. That I was bored during that part. Yeah, I know. It's not working for us either. And we have to figure out how to make it work. So you're not going to get the answer from them, but you're going to get a reaction from them. And the reactions are important. But really, what they're talking about is actually probably something 10 or 15 minutes before that wasn't set up properly. So you have to be able to discern what the solutions might be.
What about the music? How do you select the music, and more generally the soundtrack?
Well, I usually start with a big library of music and stuff that I think might be appropriate for that film. And so with this big pile of music, you begin putting things up against the picture and seeing what works. It's a dangerous thing to put the music in too soon, because good music will make bad images work, but the picture is not working. So you have to be very careful about that. On the other hand, putting music in at some point abstracts the film a little bit for me. It speaks to the emotion of the scene. And with a lot of documentaries, you're dealing with a lot of information. And you really want to get to the emotion that is underneath that. So music tends to bring it out and refocus you to what really has to happen emotionally with the thing. So that's why it's important for me to kind of get that right feel. And music's a big help getting the right feel.
I'm wondering if watching a film does require a kind of mental editing process from the spectator. How do you see that?
If I'm thinking as an editor about the editing of the movie as it's going along, then the movie has a problem. I mean, it's supposed to take you for a ride. It's supposed to make you forget how it's made. You're supposed to be experiencing it. So if the only thing that you're thinking about is why things aren't working, then it's probably not a very good movie. Like any viewer, I want to get lost in the movie. I want to go for the ride. Yeah, I don't want to be thinking, the second time see it, then you can begin to see, well, how do they do that?
Is there something essential you've learned about your own way of watching films?
In the process of making them, to watch them, it's very easy to get stuck someplace. For a long time, it doesn't work for you, a particular scene, say, and you finally get it to a point where it is working, but it may not be the solution. But at that point, you're kind of married to it in a way that's not too healthy. And so you need some distance, and maybe moving on to another part of the movie is helpful. So you leave it for a while and then come back. And that gives you a fresh eye on it. But usually you get hung up on these things, especially when it's pretty good. And this is a problem at the very end of the film. When things are working, almost, it's very hard to give stuff up. Because there really was, this series of scenes really was doing something good. But it has to do something better. And that means you have to tear things apart and try to get them to work differently and better. That's hard to give up, We call it like killing the babies at some point. This is your baby, and you have to give it up in order to get a better film.
Is it possible for you to work on two different films at the same time?
I don't, other than perhaps consulting on another project, because you kind of have to get however many hours, 700 hours of film in your head, and I'm sorry, I can't fit much more than that. So I can't take on two projects. You can kind of consult. If it's just saying, what's working and what isn't working, that you can probably do for another project. But to actually kind of start from scratch, no, it's one at a time.
Do you have a personal style in editing films?
Well, I hope it doesn't look like that, because then you're just kind of repeating yourself. But if you put them alongside of each other, you would probably find similar solutions to things. Hopefully,
but it's invisible for the audience.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully, and no one's ever going to see them side by side. But you do tend to fall back on ways of doing things, and you also believe in ways of doing things. So you're going to approach it that way. I mean, for me, it's very important in a verite film to keep a certain amount of reality in there. So while you're trying to shape it into a drama, you also have to keep the realness of it. That's kind of something that is a balance that's consistent.
What do you mean by real? We often talk of fake news and stuff like this. What do you mean by real?
I mean genuine emotion, unmanipulated responses from people. Now, whether the audience can even see this, I'm not so sure. I think they feel it on some level. I thought reality television was going to be the end of documentaries. Said it was a big boost to it. But I'm not so sure that is real, People go in with a certain idea. They try to get people to perform to this idea. We don't do that. We go in and let people do what they do, record it, and then try to manipulate the elements, the story elements, to tell it the best way possible. But we didn't give them those words to say, and we didn't tell them to do that thing with this person. We're just following along. It's not even good to ask them to repeat something because it breaks the whole mood. So I think there is definitely a reality there if you allow it to happen. And then you have to kind of feel that coming off the screen. You know, they say the difference between fiction and nonfiction. In fiction films, you're trying to get the dramatic to look real. And in nonfiction films, you try to make the real look dramatic. So in making it look dramatic, in trying to get the story elements told properly, in trying to edit a particular scene, you can make it look artificial. So you strive not to make it look artificial. I think it's documenting reality in a way that tells you the bigger story of what's going on. It's not the literal thing. It's not news. A nonfiction drama is not news. You know, it's not every phrase they said in the way they said it. But it tries to capture the reality and the truth of what was going on by manipulating those moments in a way that presents the truth behind it.
Manipulating to show the truth. That's interesting.
And it's a tricky line. It's a slippery slope. Yes. Yeah. I mean, we strive very hard to make it feel like those are genuine feelings, that that's the real moment as it was happening, even though there are edits. And the minute you make an edit, it's not exactly the way it happened, because you're choosing to show a different aspect of it. You're choosing to jump in time. You're choosing to manipulate the time and the space. I guess what an unedited thing, a fixed camera that records whatever happens, would kind of be reality. But it's usually not very interesting, and it usually doesn't tell you too much. What we're trying to do is present the story in a way that gets at what was actually happening, the motivations behind the actions, the desires of those people, the goals of those people, very much like you would in a fiction film. You're trying to express those things, and at the same time you want to feel that this is exactly what the people are doing and feeling.
It's not a manipulation to hide something. It's a manipulation to show something.
I think that's a good description of it, yeah. Yeah. The minute there's a camera there, it's going to change the reality. And the minute you cut a piece of film, you're changing what happened. You're changing it to get deeper into it, to explain it better, to get at what was happening. That's different than a lot of manipulation that's done with film.
That's the last tape of the interview. I'm gonna leave your cutting room. Please hold the microphone and add whatever you want to the interview.
I actually don't think very much about creating things. I mean, I kind of just do the job, which is, I think, trying to tell a story as best you can, and out of that process, hopefully, you add some creativity, but you don't go into it thinking that. You go in to solve a problem of trying to communicate an idea.
Thank you, Bob Eisenhardt, for sharing your story. It was Sounds Like Portraits, a podcast by Philippe Ongard. Music, Charmeuse de Serpent, composed and conducted by Olivier Glisson. See you soon for the next episode.